The blood-red sunset painted the horizon as Gabriella Hayes ran across the dusty prairie, her heart hammering against her ribs like a war drum. Sweat stung her eyes as she glanced over her shoulder, seeing the cloud of dust rising in the distance riders, at least 6 of them, gaining ground with every passing second. In 1873, a woman alone in the Wyoming Territory was as vulnerable as a newborn calf, and Gabriella knew it better than most. The satchel clutched to her chest contained everything she had left in the world. $300, a locket with her mother's portrait, and the deed to land that rightfully belonged to her. Land that powerful men wanted badly enough to kill for. Just a little further, she gasped, spotting the tree line that marked the beginning of Blackwood Creek. If she could reach it before the riders caught up, she might have a chance at losing them in the dense forest. But her worn boots caught on a prairie dog hole, sending her sprawling face first into the dirt. Pain shot through her ankle as she scrambled to stand, but it was too late. The thundering hoofbeats surrounded her, dust billowing in clouds as 6 riders circled her like wolves closing in on wounded prey. Well, what do we have here? The largest man dismounted, his spurs jingling ominously with each step. His face was weathered like old leather, with small eyes that reminded Gabriella of a rattlesnake. Miss Hayes, you've led us on quite a chase. The deed belongs to me, Harlan, Gabriella said, clutching the satchel tighter. My father left it to me fair and square. Harlan Voss laughed, the sound devoid of humor. Your pa owed me money, girl. That land's the only thing worth anything he ever had. He held out his hand. Now be sensible and hand over that deed. I'd rather die, Gabriella spat, despite the fear coursing through her veins. Harlan's eyes darkened. That can be arranged. He nodded to his men. Get her. 2 of the riders dismounted, moving toward her with predatory grins. Gabriella backed away, her injured ankle protesting with each step. She looked around frantically for anything she could use as a weapon, but there was nothing but open prairie. Then, from behind her, came the sound of another horse approaching hard and fast. The newcomer rode straight through the circle of men, positioning his mount between Gabriella and her pursuers. Dust settled to reveal a broad-shouldered man with a stern jaw shadowed by several days' growth of beard. His eyes, blue as a summer sky, surveyed the scene with cold calculation. Evening, gentlemen, he said, his voice low and steady as he kept his hand near the revolver at his hip. Seems to me you're giving this lady some trouble. This ain't your concern, stranger, Harlan growled. The girl's stolen something that belongs to me. The newcomer's gaze flickered briefly to Gabriella, then back to Harlan. 6 men against 1 woman? Doesn't seem like a fair fight to me. Last warning. Ride on. Harlan's hand moved toward his holster. In one fluid motion, the stranger drew his revolver, the metal gleaming in the dying sunlight. Not one of you touches her, he said, his voice carrying an authority that made even Harlan hesitate. Not while I'm breathing. Gabriella watched, barely daring to breathe as the standoff stretched between the men. Harlan's eyes narrowed, assessing the stranger, whose gun hand remained perfectly steady. You willing to die for a woman you don't even know? Harlan asked. Are you willing to die for a piece of paper? The stranger countered. Because I guarantee at least 2 of you won't ride away from this. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Finally, Harlan spat on the ground near the stranger's horse. This ain't over, he said, mounting his horse with practiced ease. Come on, boys. The riders departed reluctantly, throwing dark glances over their shoulders as they rode away. Only when they were small dots on the horizon did the stranger holster his weapon and turn to Gabriella. Are you hurt, madam? He asked, dismounting and approaching her with careful steps, as if she were a skittish colt. Just my ankle, Gabriella replied, still clutching her satchel protectively. And my pride. She studied him warily. Why did you help me? My ma raised me to step in when I see something that ain't right, he said simply. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. Brendan Callahan, at your service. Gabriella Hayes, she said, extending her hand somewhat hesitantly. His palm was rough with calluses when it enveloped hers, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. Those men will be back, Brendan said, glancing in the direction Harlan and his gang had disappeared. And they'll bring more next time. Gabriella nodded grimly. They want my land. My father's land, she corrected herself. He died 2 weeks ago. Left me everything, including a ranch that Harlan Voss seems to think belongs to him. Brendan frowned. Voss has a reputation in these parts. He's not a man who gives up easily. Neither am I, Gabriella said with determination, though she couldn't keep the weariness from her voice. She tried to take a step and winced as pain shot through her injured ankle. Without asking permission, Brendan scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, setting her gently on his horse. The nearest town is Timber Creek, about 5 miles west. There's a doctor there who can look at that ankle. I can't go to town, Gabriella protested. Voss has men there. They'll be watching for me. Brendan considered this, his brow furrowed in thought. Then we'll head to my camp. It's not far, just beyond those trees by Blackwood Creek. You can rest there while we figure out what to do next. Gabriella raised an eyebrow. Mr. Callahan, I appreciate your help, but this isn't your fight. A ghost of a smile touched Brendan's lips. It became my fight when I drew on Harlan Voss, madam. Now he'll be looking for both of us. He took the reins of his horse and began leading it toward the tree line. Besides, I've got no love for men who chase down women across the prairie. Gabriella wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was catching up with her. The adrenaline that had kept her going was fading, leaving her shaky and light-headed. She'd been running for 2 days, sleeping in fits and starts, always listening for hoofbeats. Thank you, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Brendan nodded without looking back, leading his horse through the tall grass as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Gabriella watched his broad shoulders, the confident way he moved, and wondered what kind of man would risk his life for a stranger. In her experience, men always wanted something in return. As they entered the shelter of the trees, the sounds of the prairie gave way to the gentle gurgle of Blackwood Creek. Brendan's camp was simple but well organized. A small tent, a fire pit ringed with stones, and a lean to where a second horse was tethered. He helped her down from his horse, supporting her weight as she hobbled to a fallen log near the fire pit. As he busied himself building a fire, Gabriella took the opportunity to study him more closely. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, but there was a wariness about him too, the kind that came from hard experience. How long have you been out here? She asked as flames began to lick at the kindling. Camping in these parts? About 2 weeks, Brendan replied, adding larger sticks to the growing fire. Been tracking a herd of mustangs that roam these hills. You're a horse trader? Among other things. He straightened up, the firelight casting shadows across his face. I break horses, mostly. Sell them to ranchers who need good stock. And that pays well enough to live on? A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It keeps me fed and my powder dry. That's enough for me. He moved to his saddlebags and pulled out a tin of coffee and a small sack. Are you hungry? I've got jerky and hardtack. Not much of a feast, but it'll fill your belly. Gabriella nodded gratefully. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten a proper meal. As Brendan prepared a simple supper, She unlaced her boot with careful fingers, wincing as she eased it off her swollen ankle. "Let me see that," Brendan said, kneeling before her. Without waiting for permission, he gently took her foot in his hands, his touch clinical as he examined the injury. "It's not broken, just a bad sprain. I've got some liniment that might help with the swelling." He retrieved a small jar from his saddlebags and returned to kneel at her feet. The liniment smelled strongly of camphor and herbs as he worked it into her skin with careful fingers. "Where did you learn to do this?" Gabriella asked, trying to ignore the strange intimacy of having this man tend to her injury. "You spend enough time around horses, you learn a thing or two about sprains," Brendan replied with a half-smile. "My brother's a doctor back east. He taught me some things before I headed west." "Why did you come west?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Brendan's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their gentle ministrations. "Same reason as most, I suppose. Looking for something I couldn't find back home." "And did you find it?" He looked up at her, his blue eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Still looking," he said simply. They ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire and distant call of night birds the only sounds. Despite her wariness, Gabriella found herself relaxing in Brendan's presence. There was something solid about him, dependable in a way she hadn't encountered in a long time. "Tell me about this land of yours," Brendan said finally, refilling their tin cups with coffee. Gabriella's hand went instinctively to the satchel at her side. "It's called Willow Creek Ranch. 300 acres of good grazing land with a year-round creek running through it. My father built it from nothing after the war." "And Voss claims your father owed him money?" "He says my father borrowed $500 last winter to get through the hard times after we lost half our cattle in the blizzard." Gabriella's jaw tightened. "But my father would never have borrowed from Voss. He hated the man." "Any proof one way or the other?" She shook her head. "Just my word against his. But the deed is clear, the ranch belongs to me now." Brendan stared into the fire, his expression thoughtful. "Voss owns half the businesses in Timber Creek. Judge Crawford answers to him. Even if you're in the right, the law might not be on your side." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Gabriella asked, frustration evident in her voice. "Let him steal my home?" "No," Brendan said firmly. "But we need to be smart about this. Voss isn't the type to give up easily, especially now that I've humiliated him in front of his men." "I didn't ask you to get involved," Gabriella reminded him, though there was no heat in her words. Brendan's lips quirked upward. "No, you didn't. But here we are all the same." He set his coffee cup aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Get some rest, Miss Hayes. Tomorrow we'll head to my friend's place north of here. He's got no love for Voss either, and he might be able to help us figure out our next move." "Gabriella," she said, "if we're going to be running for our lives together, you might as well use my given name." He nodded, a genuine smile warming his features. "Gabriella it is. And I'm Brendan." He gave her his bedroll, insisting she take the tent while he slept by the fire. Despite her exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily to Gabriella. She lay awake, listening to the night sounds and thinking about the man sleeping just outside the tent flap. A man who had risked his life for her without hesitation. In her 22 years, Gabriella had learned to be wary of men and their motives. Her father had been the exception, gruff but loving, teaching her to ride and shoot and manage the ranch alongside him. After her mother died of fever when Gabriella was 12, it had been just the two of them against the world. Now he was gone too, and she was alone. Or she had been, until Brendan Callahan rode into her life like something out of a dime novel. Gabriella touched the satchel beside her, reassuring herself that the deed was still there. Whatever happened next, She wouldn't give up her father's legacy without a fight. And for the first time in 2 weeks, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to fight alone. Dawn broke clear and cool, the first golden rays of sunlight filtering through the canvas of the tent. Gabriella awakened to the smell of coffee and the soft sounds of movement outside. Her ankle throbbed dully as she pulled on her boot, but the swelling had gone down considerably overnight. Emerging from the tent, she found Brendan already dressed and ready for the day, his hair damp from washing in the creek. He looked up as she approached, offering a tin cup of steaming coffee. "Sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I have in days," she admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. "Thank you." He nodded, turning his attention to the small fire where a pan of beans simmered. "We should get moving soon. It's about a half-day's ride to my friend's place, and I'd rather not be out in the open any longer than necessary." Gabriella sipped her coffee, watching as he efficiently broke down the camp, packing everything neatly into saddlebags and bedrolls. There was something comforting about his methodical movements, the quiet competence with which he handled every task. "Your friend," she said. "Can he be trusted?" Brendan paused in his work, meeting her gaze directly. "With my life. And yours." He finished rolling up the tent. Benjamin Foster was a Union officer during the war. Now he's got a small spread north of here. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's a good man in a tight spot. They ate a quick breakfast before Brendan saddled both horses. He helped Gabriella mount the smaller of the two, a dappled gray mare with intelligent eyes. "This is Whisper," he said, patting the mare's neck. "She's gentle but sure-footed. She'll take good care of you." Gabriella ran her hand along the mare's silky mane. "She's beautiful." "One of my first breaks," Brendan said with evident pride as he swung up onto his own mount, a powerful bay stallion. "Found her running wild in Colorado territory 2 years ago." They set off at a steady pace, keeping to the tree line when possible and traversing open ground quickly when they had to. Brendan led the way, occasionally glancing back to check on Gabriella, but otherwise remaining vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses by a small stream. As Gabriella slid from the saddle, wincing slightly as her injured ankle touched the ground, Brendan was immediately at her side, offering his arm for support. "It's much better today," she assured him, though she didn't refuse his help. Still, no sense putting more strain on it than necessary. He led her to a flat rock by the stream's edge where she could sit comfortably. As the horses drank, Brendan produced jerky and dried apples from his saddlebags, sharing them with Gabriella. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the midday sun warming their shoulders. "Tell me about your ranch," Brendan said finally. "What made it special to you?" Gabriella's expression softened as she thought of home. "It's nestled in a valley with hills all around. In spring, the meadows are full of wildflowers, blue lupin and golden poppies as far as you can see. There's a stand of willows by the creek where I used to sit and read when I was younger." She smiled at the memory. "The house isn't much, just 4 rooms and a porch, but my father built it with his own hands. Added a room when my mother was expecting me." "Sounds peaceful," Brendan remarked. "It was," Gabriella agreed, her smile fading. "Until last winter. The blizzard was worse than anything we'd seen in years. We lost nearly half our cattle, and then my father took sick." She swallowed hard. "Pneumonia. He never really recovered his strength after that." Brendan's eyes held sympathy but no pity. "And Voss started circling like a vulture." She nodded grimly. "At first, he offered to buy the ranch. When my father refused, he started claiming there was a debt. After Pa died, Voss gave me 3 days to clear out before he'd have the sheriff evict me." Her jaw set determinedly. "I took the deed and ran." Smart move, Brendan said. Though I imagine running wasn't easy for you. Gabriella looked at him sharply, surprised by his perception. No, she admitted. It wasn't, but I'll go back. Somehow. Brendan nodded, his expression thoughtful. We'll figure something out. He stood, brushing crumbs from his trousers. We should keep moving. As they continued north, the landscape gradually changed. The open prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with stands of pine and aspen. By late afternoon, they crested a ridge that overlooked a small valley where a neat cabin and barn stood beside a fenced pasture. Foster's place, Brendan said, a note of relief in his voice. They approached cautiously nonetheless, Brendan whistling a distinct pattern as they neared the cabin. A moment later, a tall, lean man with salt and pepper hair emerged, rifle in hand. Upon seeing Brendan, he lowered the weapon and raised his hand in greeting. Callahan. Wasn't expecting to see you for another week, the man called out, his face breaking into a smile that erased years from his weathered features. Circumstances changed, Ben, Brendan replied as they reached the yard. This is Miss Gabriella Hayes. She could use a safe place to rest for a while. Benjamin Foster's keen gray eyes took in Gabriella's disheveled appearance and the careful way she dismounted. Any friend of Brendan's is welcome here, he said, offering his hand to help her down. Especially one who looks like she's had a rough time of it. Thank you, Mr. Foster, Gabriella said, grateful for the man's immediate acceptance. Just Foster, miss. Everyone calls me that. He nodded toward the cabin. Come on in. Got stew on the stove and coffee ready to pour. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly comfortable, with well-crafted furniture and shelves lined with books. A fire burned in the stone hearth, taking the autumn chill from the air. While Foster served bowls of venison stew, Brendan explained their situation, including the confrontation with Harlan Voss and his men. Foster listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail. Voss is a problem, no doubt about it, he said when Brendan finished. He's been buying up land all over the territory, some of it through means that wouldn't bear close inspection. You know him? Gabriella asked. Foster's mouth twisted in distaste. We've crossed paths. He tried to buy my place last year. When I refused, there was a mysterious fire that took out my north fence line. He shrugged. Can't prove he was behind it, but I started sleeping with a loaded rifle beside my bed after that. We need to find a way to prove the debt is fraudulent, Brendan said, returning to the problem at hand. Otherwise, Voss will just wait us out. Sooner or later, Gabriella will need to go back to the ranch. Could be there's evidence at your place, Foster suggested, looking at Gabriella. Your father keep records? Letters? Anything that might show his dealings with Voss? Gabriella nodded slowly. He had a strongbox he kept important papers in. It's hidden under a floorboard in his bedroom. Her eyes widened with sudden realization. And his journal. Pa wrote in it every night. If Voss really loaned him money, it would be mentioned there. So we need to get to those papers before Voss does, Brendan said, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. If he hasn't found them already, Foster pointed out. How long since you left the ranch? 5 days, Gabriella replied, her heart sinking. Voss probably has men there by now. Maybe not, Foster said thoughtfully. Voss likes to do things with at least a veneer of legality. Without the deed, he can't just move in. He'd need the sheriff to evict you officially, and that takes time, even with the judge in his pocket. Hope flickered in Gabriella's chest. So there's a chance the papers are still there? It's worth finding out, Brendan said decisively. How far is your ranch from here? About 20 miles southwest, Gabriella replied. If we left at dawn, we could be there by midday. We, Brendan raised an eyebrow. "It's my home," Gabriella said firmly, "and I know where everything is hidden." Brendan and Foster exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. "She's right," Foster said finally. "Besides, 2 is better than 1 if there's trouble." Brendan nodded reluctantly. "First light, then. But we'll need to be careful. Scout the place before going in." "I might be able to help with that," Foster said, rising from the table. He went to a chest in the corner and returned with a brass spyglass. "Army issue. Lets you see clear details from half a mile away." As night fell, Foster insisted Gabriella take his bed while he made do with a pallet by the fire. Brendan took first watch outside, despite Foster's assurances that his place was secure. Unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Gabriella slipped outside to find Brendan sitting on the porch steps, his rifle across his knees as he gazed at the star-filled sky. "Shouldn't you be resting?" he asked without turning around. "I could ask you the same thing," Gabriella replied, settling beside him on the step, careful to leave appropriate space between them. "I'm used to keeping watch," Brendan said simply. "Comes with the territory when you spend most of your time in the open." "Have you always lived like this? Moving from place to place?" He was quiet for so long that Gabriella thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. "No, I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania, youngest of 4 boys. My father expected us all to stay and work the land, but I always wanted something different." He ran a hand through his dark hair. "When the war came, my brothers and I all enlisted. Only 2 of us came home." "I'm sorry," Gabriella said softly. Brendan nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. "After, I couldn't settle back into farm life. Everything felt too small somehow, so I headed west." He glanced at her. "What about you?" "Always lived at Willow Creek." "Born and raised there," Gabriella confirmed. "My parents came west right after they married in '48. They were among the first settlers in that valley." Pride colored her voice. "My mother taught me to read and write, and my father taught me everything else: how to ride, shoot, mend fences, birth calves." "Sounds like good people." They were. Gabriella drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the night chill. "I can't lose their legacy, Brendan. That land is all I have left of them." "You won't lose it," he said with quiet determination. "We'll find a way to stop Voss." The certainty in his voice was comforting, even if Gabriella wasn't sure she shared his confidence. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as clouds drifted across the moon. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally, the question that had been nagging at her since he first rode between her and Voss's men. "You don't know me. This isn't your fight." Brendan turned to look at her, his eyes silver in the moonlight. "Some things a man does because they need doing," he said simply. "When I saw you surrounded by those riders, there wasn't really a choice to make. Most men would have ridden the other way. I'm not most men." There was no boast in his tone, just a quiet statement of fact. Gabriella studied him, trying to reconcile this man with her experience of the world. In her 22 years, she'd learned that people rarely acted without self-interest. Yet here was Brendan Callahan, risking his life for a stranger with nothing to gain and everything to lose. "No," she agreed softly. "You're not." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, or the first tentative threads of trust taking root. Whatever it was, it warmed Gabriella more effectively than any fire could have. "You should get some rest," Brendan said, breaking the spell. "Tomorrow will come early enough." Gabriella nodded, rising to her feet. "Good night, Brendan." "Good night, Gabriella." As she made her way back to the cabin, she felt his eyes following her, watchful and protective. For the first time since her father's death, Gabriella didn't feel entirely alone. Morning brought a light fog that clung to the valley like a shroud, obscuring the distant hills. Gabriella awakened to find Foster already preparing breakfast while Brendan tended to the horses outside. They ate quickly, Foster providing them with extra provisions for the journey. As Gabriella packed the supplies into saddlebags, she overheard the two men talking in low voices near the barn. "Don't like the odds, Callahan," Foster was saying. "Voss isn't one to forget a slight." "I know," Brendan replied. "But what choice do we have? Without proof, he'll just keep coming after her." Foster sighed heavily. "Just watch yourself. And if things go sideways, head for the old mining camp in the North Ridge. You know the one. Let's hope it doesn't come to that." They set out as the fog was lifting, riding southwest with the rising sun at their backs. Brendan insisted they stick to less traveled paths, even though it added time to their journey. By midday, they had reached a ridge overlooking a small valley where Willow Creek Ranch nestled among stands of golden aspen. From their vantage point, they could see the ranch house, barn, and corrals. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, confirming Gabriella's fears that someone was occupying her home. "2 horses in the corral," Brendan observed, studying the property through Foster's spyglass. "1 man on the porch, another by the barn." "Voss's men?" Gabriella asked, her stomach knotting with anger and anxiety. "Most likely." Brendan handed her the spyglass. "Take a look. Anyone you recognize?" Gabriella peered through the brass instrument, adjusting the focus until the figures came into clear view. "The one on the porch is Jake Durbin. He works for Voss." "I don't know the other one." "Armed, both wearing sidearms. And there's a rifle leaning against the porch railing." Brendan took back the spyglass, scanning the surrounding area carefully. "No sign of others, but that doesn't mean they're not around." He lowered the glass, his expression thoughtful. "We'll wait until dark. Better chance of getting in and out unnoticed." They retreated to a small copse of trees about a mile from the ranch, making a cold camp as they waited for nightfall. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Gabriella grew increasingly restless. "Tell me about the layout," Brendan said, clearly trying to distract her. "Where exactly is the strongbox?" Gabriella drew a rough map in the dirt with a stick. "Pa's bedroom is here, on the east side of the house. The floorboard is loose under the rug beside his bed. And his journal would be in the top drawer of his desk in the main room. Any other ways in besides the front door? Back door through the kitchen. And Pa put in a small window in his bedroom, said he wanted to be able to see the sunrise. It's about 4 feet off the ground." Brendan nodded, committing the details to memory. "Once it's dark, we'll approach from the east. I'll create a distraction while you slip in through the bedroom window and get the papers." "What kind of distraction?" A ghost of a smile crossed Brendan's face. "Something that'll draw them away from the house, don't worry." As twilight deepened into full darkness, they made their final preparations. Brendan checked his revolver, ensuring it was fully loaded before holstering it. He offered Gabriella a small derringer. "Just in case," he said. "Do you know how to use it?" Gabriella took the weapon, checking it with practiced ease. "My father made sure I could handle a gun by the time I was 14, she said with a hint of pride. They left the horses secured in the trees and proceeded on foot, keeping low as they made their way across the moonlit pasture toward the ranch. As they neared the barn, Brendan touched Gabriella's arm, bringing her to a halt. "Wait here until you see them moving away from the house," he whispered. "Then go straight for the bedroom window. Get what you need and get out. Don't wait for me if there's trouble." "I'm not leaving without you," Gabriella whispered back fiercely. Brendan's eyes softened momentarily. "Just be careful," he said, squeezing her arm gently before melting into the shadows. Gabriella crouched behind a water trough, watching the house. Minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. Then, suddenly, there was a loud crash from the direction of the barn, followed by the panicked whinnying of horses. The effect was immediate. Both men bolted from the house, guns drawn, running toward the commotion. As soon as they disappeared around the corner of the barn, Gabriella sprinted across the yard to the east side of the house. The bedroom window was exactly as she described, small but large enough for her to slip through. Standing on tiptoe, she peered inside to ensure it was empty before easing the window open and pulling herself up and through. Her father's room was much as she'd left it, though someone had clearly been searching through his belongings. The dresser drawers stood half open, and his old trunk had been dragged from under the bed and ransacked. Working quickly, Gabriella rolled back the braided rug beside the bed and located the loose floorboard. Her fingers found the familiar edge, and she pried it up to reveal a small cavity beneath. Relief flooded through her as she spotted the metal strongbox, right where it had always been. The key was on a leather cord around her neck, tucked safely beneath her blouse. With trembling fingers, she unlocked the box and lifted the lid. Inside were her father's most important papers. His discharge papers from the army, the original deed to the land, she had been carrying the copy, her mother's marriage certificate, and a small packet of letters tied with faded ribbon. Quickly, she searched through the documents, looking for anything related to Harlan Voss. Near the bottom of the stack, she found what she was hoping for: a ledger where her father had meticulously recorded all debts and payments. Scanning through the pages, she found no mention of any loan from Voss. Gabriella stuffed the ledger and a few other papers into her jacket before replacing the strongbox and floorboard. She had just repositioned the rug when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold: the front door opening. Freezing in place, she strained to listen. Heavy footsteps crossed the main room, accompanied by angry muttering. Only one set of footsteps, she realized with relief. One of the men had returned to the house while the other was still dealing with whatever distraction Brendan had created. Moving as silently as possible, Gabriella crept to the bedroom door, which stood slightly ajar. Through the gap, she could see into the main room where Jake Durbin was pouring himself a drink from her father's whiskey bottle. His back was to her as he stood by the fireplace. The desk with her father's journal was on the far side of the room. To reach it, she would have to cross directly behind Durbin. It was too risky. She would have to leave the journal behind. Just as she was about to retreat to the window, Durbin turned and headed toward the kitchen, muttering something about checking the back door. This was her chance. Gabriella slipped through the bedroom door and crossed the room in a few quick strides. The desk drawer opened with a faint squeak that seemed thunderous in the quiet house. Inside, just as she'd hoped, was her father's leather-bound journal. As she reached for it, a floorboard creaked beneath her feet. In the kitchen, the footsteps stopped. "Who's there?" Durbin called out, his voice sharp with suspicion. Gabriella grabbed the journal and turned to flee, but it was too late. Durbin reappeared in the doorway, his hand dropping to his holster when he saw her. "Well, well," he drawled, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Look what the cat dragged in. Mr. Voss will be mighty pleased to see you, Miss Hayes." "Get out of my house," Gabriella said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Durbin took a step forward. "Now, that ain't no way to talk to a guest. Especially since this house don't rightly belong to you no more." Gabriella's fingers closed around the derringer in her pocket. "My father's ledger says differently. There was never any loan from Voss." Something flashed in Durbin's eyes: uncertainty, perhaps, or concern. "Don't matter what some book says. Mr. Voss has an agreement with your pa's signature on it." "A forgery," Gabriella said with certainty. My father would never. She was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass from the kitchen, followed by a heavy thud. Durbin whirled around, drawing his gun, but he wasn't fast enough. Brendan emerged from the shadows of the kitchen, bringing the butt of his revolver down hard on Durbin's wrist. The gun clattered to the floor as Durbin howled in pain. Before the man could recover, Brendan landed a solid punch to his jaw, sending him sprawling unconscious to the floor. "Are you all right?" Brendan asked, his eyes quickly scanning Gabriella for any sign of injury. She nodded, holding up the journal. "I got what we came for. Where's the other one?" "Tied up in the barn," Brendan said with a grim smile. "Won't be joining us anytime soon." He glanced down at Durbin. "We should do the same with this one before he wakes up." Using rope from the kitchen, they bound Durbin securely and gagged him with a dish towel. Then they made a hasty search of the house, gathering a few more of Gabriella's belongings, including a photograph of her parents that had stood on the mantelpiece. "We need to go," Brendan said, peering out the window into the darkness. No telling when Voss might send more men to check on these two. Gabriella cast a last look around the home she had grown up in, her heart aching at the thought of leaving it again. But Brendan was right, they couldn't stay. They slipped out through the back door and made their way across the moonlit yard, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. Just as they reached the edge of the pasture, a horse nickered softly from the direction of the road. Brendan pulled Gabriella down behind a fallen log, his hand going to his holster. They waited, hardly daring to breathe, as a rider approached the house. In the silvery moonlight, there was no mistaking the broad-shouldered silhouette of Harlan Voss. "Perfect timing," Brendan whispered, his lips close to Gabriella's ear. "Let's hope he's alone." They watched as Voss dismounted and tied his horse to the porch rail. He called out for Durbin and the other man, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. When no one responded, he drew his gun and cautiously entered the house. "Now," Brendan said, and they ran, bent low, across the open ground toward the trees where they had left their horses. They were halfway to safety when a shout rang out behind them. Voss had emerged from the house and spotted their fleeing figures in the moonlight. "Keep going," Brendan urged, pushing Gabriella ahead of him as the first bullet whistled past them. They reached the trees just as Voss fired again, the shot splintering bark inches from Gabriella's head. Brendan returned fire, not aiming to hit but to force Voss to take cover, buying them precious seconds to mount their horses. As they galloped away from the ranch, more shots rang out behind them, but soon faded as distance and darkness separated them from their pursuer. Brendan led them on a winding path through the hills, frequently changing direction to throw off any attempt to follow their trail. It was nearly dawn when they finally stopped at a small stream to rest the horses. Gabriella slid from the saddle, her legs trembling with exhaustion and the aftermath of fear. "Do you think he's still following us?" she asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Brendan shook his head. "Not tonight, but he'll be on our trail as soon as it's light enough to see. We need to keep moving." "Where are we going?" "Back to Foster's for now. It's the safest place until we figure out our next move." He looked at her with concern. "How are you holding up?" Gabriella managed a tired smile. "I'm all right. Better than all right, actually." She patted her jacket where the journal and ledger were safely tucked. "We have what we came for." They allowed themselves and the horses only a brief rest before continuing on, taking a different route back to Foster's place to further confuse any pursuit. The sun was high in the sky by the time they crested the final ridge overlooking Foster's valley. As they approached the cabin, Foster emerged with his rifle ready, relaxing only when he recognized them. His weathered face broke into a relieved smile. "Beginning to think you two weren't coming back," he called out as they dismounted in the yard. "Had a bit of excitement," Brendan replied dryly, leading the tired horses toward the barn. Inside the cabin, over hot coffee and a hastily prepared meal, they recounted their adventure. Foster listened intently, his expression growing darker when they described their narrow escape from Voss. "Man's not going to take this lying down," he warned, "especially now that you've got evidence against him." Gabriella opened her father's journal, carefully turning the pages until she found the entries from the previous winter. She read aloud, December 18th, 1872. Harlan Voss came by again today, offering to buy the ranch. Says the winter will finish us off and I might as well sell now. Told him I'd sooner deed the place to the devil himself. He didn't take it well. She turned a few more pages. January 30th, 1873. Lost 12 more head in the north pasture. Down to less than half our herd now. Voss sent his man Durbin with another offer, lower than the last. Seems to think desperation will change my mind. It won't. Gabriella looked up, her eyes bright with vindication. There's not a single mention of any loan, but there is this. She turned to one of the final entries, dated just 2 weeks before her father's death. Voss came himself today. No more offers to buy, just threats thinly disguised as concern. Says I owe him for services rendered last fall when he helped round up strays after the early snow. First I've heard of any debt. Man's becoming dangerous in his desperation to get this land. Your father was right about that, Foster said grimly. Question is, what do we do now? Even with this evidence, going up against Voss won't be easy. He's got the judge and half the county in his pocket. We need to go over his head, Brendan said thoughtfully. The territorial governor has been trying to clean up corruption. If we could get these documents to him in Cheyenne. That's a 4-day ride, Foster pointed out. And you can bet Voss will have men watching all the roads. Then we don't take the roads, Brendan replied, a determined glint in his eye. I know these hills better than most. There are ways to Cheyenne that don't appear on any map. It's worth the risk, Gabriella said firmly. This is the only chance I have of getting my home back. Foster studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You'll need supplies, and fresh horses for part of the journey. He rose from the table. I'll see what I can put together. As Foster busied himself gathering provisions, Brendan and Gabriella pored over a rough map of the territory, plotting the safest route to Cheyenne. It would take them through some of the most rugged country in Wyoming mountains, forests, and high plains where shelter was scarce and dangers plenty. We should leave at first light tomorrow, Brendan said, tracing a path through the foothills with his finger. Push hard the first day to put as much distance between us and Voss as possible. Gabriella nodded, studying his face in the lamplight. The events of the past 2 days had left dark circles under his eyes, and a day's growth of beard shadowed his jaw. Yet there was an unwavering strength in his features that reassured her. Why are you still helping me? She asked softly, so that Foster wouldn't overhear from where he was packing saddlebags. You've already done more than anyone could expect. Brendan's eyes met hers, honest and direct. Because it's not finished, he said simply. And I don't leave things half done. There was more to it than that, Gabriella suspected, but she didn't press him. Instead, she placed her hand briefly over his where it rested on the map. Thank you, she said, for everything. Something flickered in his eyes, a warmth that made her heart beat a little faster. But before he could respond, Foster returned with an armload of supplies, breaking the moment. That night, Gabriella slept fitfully, her dreams filled with pursuing riders and Harlan Voss's menacing face. She awakened before dawn, the cabin still dark except for the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. Rising quietly, she dressed in the clothes Foster had provided: sturdy trousers, a flannel shirt, and a heavy coat better suited for the journey ahead than her tattered dress had been. She had just finished braiding her hair when Brendan entered from outside, bringing with him the crisp scent of the pre-dawn air. "Horses are ready," he said quietly, accepting the cup of coffee she offered him. "Foster's given us his best mare to swap out for Whisper once we cross the Medicine Bow. She's got more stamina for mountain trails." Gabriella nodded, trying to quell the nervousness fluttering in her stomach. The journey ahead was dangerous, but the alternative, losing her home and letting Voss win, was unthinkable. They set out as the first pale light of dawn touched the eastern horizon. Foster saw them off with a promise to keep an eye out for Voss's men and a warning to trust no one along the way. "Send word when you reach Cheyenne," he called after them. "And watch your backs." The first day's ride was hard and fast, with few stops and little conversation. Brendan set a grueling pace, clearly intent on putting as much distance as possible between them and any pursuit. They kept to high ground when they could, avoiding the more traveled valleys where they might be spotted. By nightfall, they had reached the foothills of the Medicine Bow Mountains, where Brendan finally called a halt in a sheltered hollow beside a small stream. They made a cold camp, not risking a fire that might be seen from a distance. As they shared a simple meal of jerky, hard bread, and dried fruit, Gabriella studied Brendan in the gathering darkness. He had been vigilant all day, constantly scanning their back trail and the surrounding terrain for any sign of danger. "Do you think they're following us?" she asked, keeping her voice low though there was no one for miles to overhear. Brendan finished chewing a piece of jerky before answering. "Hard to say. Voss isn't the type to give up easily, but we've covered a lot of ground today, and we've been careful about our trail." "How long to Cheyenne from here?" 3 days if the weather holds and we don't run into trouble." He glanced up at the sky, where stars were beginning to appear. "We'll cross the Medicine Bow tomorrow, then follow the Laramie River Valley for a stretch before cutting east toward Cheyenne." Gabriella nodded, trying to visualize the route on the map they had studied. "Have you made this journey before?" "Parts of it," Brendan admitted. "Never all the way to Cheyenne by this route. But I've spent enough time in these mountains to know the way." As the temperature dropped with the setting sun, they spread their bedrolls close together for warmth. Despite her exhaustion, Gabriella found it hard to sleep, too aware of Brendan's presence just a few feet away. His steady breathing was somehow both comforting and unsettling. "Brendan," she whispered after a long silence. "Are you awake?" Came the soft response. "I've been thinking about what happens after, if we succeed in Cheyenne." There was a rustle as he turned toward her in the darkness. "You'll get your ranch back." "Yes, but—" Gabriella hesitated, unsure how to express the thoughts that had been tumbling through her mind. "Running a ranch alone isn't easy. My father always said it takes at least 2 people to make a go of it." "You'll manage," Brendan said, his voice warm with confidence. "From what I've seen, you're more than capable." "That's not what I meant," Gabriella said, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "I was wondering what your plans are after." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. "I haven't thought that far ahead," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Oh," Gabriella was glad for the darkness that hid her flushed cheeks. "I just thought—" "Never mind." More silence, then the sound of Brendan shifting position again. "We should get some sleep," he said gently. "Long day tomorrow." "Yes, of course." Gabriella turned onto her side, facing away from him, embarrassment and disappointment warring in her chest. What had she been thinking? Brendan Callahan was a drifter, a man who by his own admission had been looking for something for years. Why would he want to settle down on a struggling ranch with a woman he barely knew? Sleep came eventually, but it was fitful and filled with confusing dreams. Gabriella awakened at first light to find Brendan already up, checking the horses and repacking their supplies. They set off in awkward silence, the easy camaraderie of previous days replaced by a tension neither seemed willing to address. As they began the ascent into the Medicine Bow, the trail narrowed, forcing them to ride single file, which at least provided an excuse for the lack of conversation. The mountains rose majestically around them, pine forests giving way to rocky slopes as they climbed higher. By midday, they had reached a pass that offered a breathtaking view of the valley they had left behind and the rugged peaks ahead. As they paused to rest the horses, Gabriella moved to stand beside Brendan, who was scanning the horizon with Foster's spyglass. "See anything?" she asked, breaking the silence that had persisted all morning. "Nothing concerning," he replied, lowering the glass. "No sign of pursuit." Gabriella nodded, gathering her courage to address the awkwardness between them. "About last night." "No need to explain." Brendan cut her off, his voice gentle but firm. "We're both tired and under a lot of pressure. Things get said." "That's not it," Gabriella insisted. "I meant what I said, or what I was trying to say." She took a deep breath. "These past few days with you, they've changed something in me. Made me see possibilities I never considered before." Brendan turned to look at her fully, his blue eyes searching her face. "Gabriella, I know it's fast," she hurried on. "Too fast, probably. But out here, with everything that's happened, it feels like we've known each other much longer." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, it does." Encouraged, Gabriella continued. "I'm not asking for promises. I know you've spent years wandering, looking for something. I'm just saying, maybe what you're looking for isn't a place. Maybe it's a purpose, something worth staying for." Brendan was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. "You might be right," he said finally, his voice low and thoughtful. "These past few days, helping you, it's felt more right than anything has in a long time." Hope bloomed in Gabriella's chest, warm and unexpected. Before she could respond, however, Brendan's expression changed, his eyes narrowing as he looked past her. "Get down," he said sharply, pulling her behind the shelter of a large boulder. "What is it?" Gabriella whispered, her heart suddenly racing. "Riders," Brendan said grimly, reaching for the spyglass again. "Coming up the trail behind us." Carefully, he peered around the edge of the boulder, focusing the glass on the distant figures. "3 of them," he reported. "Still a ways back, but moving fast. Voss's men. Can't tell for sure. But who else would be following this trail?" Brendan's mind was clearly working rapidly. "They haven't spotted us yet. If we move now, we can lose them in the higher passes." They mounted quickly, abandoning the main trail for a narrower path that wound steeply upward through dense stands of pine. The going was slower, with fallen trees and rocky outcroppings forcing them to dismount and lead the horses in several places. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered over the mountains, and a chill wind whipped through the trees, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Brendan paused, studying the increasingly treacherous terrain ahead. "We need to find shelter before this storm hits," he said, his brow furrowed with concern. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 2 miles ahead, if I remember right. Should be just above that ridge." They pressed on, the first fat raindrops beginning to fall as they crested the ridge. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by the low rumble of thunder. Gabriella pulled her coat tighter around her, shivering as the temperature dropped further. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was little more than a crude shelter, 4 walls of rough-hewn logs with a sagging roof and a single small window. But it was dry inside, and the stone fireplace appeared intact. While Gabriella tended to the horses in the lean-to attached to the cabin, Brendan gathered firewood and kindling from the surrounding forest. By the time the storm broke in earnest, they had a small fire crackling in the hearth, casting warm light and dancing shadows around the cabin's single room. "What about the men following us?" Gabriella asked as they huddled near the fire, their wet outer garments hanging from pegs to dry. "This storm will cover our tracks," Brendan replied, stirring the pot of beans he had placed over the flames. "And they'll be looking for shelter too. With luck, they'll hole up somewhere lower down the mountain until it passes." Outside, the wind howled and rain lashed against the small window. Inside, despite the drafts that whistled through gaps in the walls, the fire kept the worst of the chill at bay. They ate their simple meal in companionable silence, the awkwardness of the morning forgotten in the face of their narrow escape and the shared relief of finding shelter from the storm. As they sipped coffee afterward, sitting side by side on a rough bench near the fire, Gabriella found herself studying Brendan's profile. In the flickering firelight, the planes and angles of his face were thrown into sharp relief: the strong line of his jaw, the slight cleft in his chin, the fan of laugh lines at the corner of his eye. There was a quiet strength about him that drew her, a steadiness she had never encountered in any other man. As if sensing her gaze, Brendan turned to look at her. Something in his eyes made her breath catch a warmth, a question, perhaps even a decision reached. "What you said earlier," he began, his voice low and intimate in the small space between them, "about finding a purpose. Something worth staying for." Gabriella nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I've been thinking about it all day," Brendan continued, "about what I've been looking for all these years." He set his coffee cup aside and, with careful deliberation, took her hand in his. "Maybe you're right. Maybe what I've been searching for isn't a place at all." Gabriella's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must feel it through their clasped hands. "Brendan, I know it's fast," he said, echoing her earlier words. "Too fast by most standards. But out here life moves at its own pace. And sometimes you just know." "Know what?" Gabriella whispered, hardly daring to hope. Instead of answering with words, Brendan leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When she didn't, he closed the distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. The kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more needful. Gabriella's hands found their way to Brendan's shoulders, then to the nape of his neck, fingers threading through his dark hair as she pulled him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Brendan rested his forehead against hers. "I think I might have found what I've been looking for," he murmured. Gabriella smiled, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "So have I," she whispered back. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the cabin's rough walls, a different kind of tempest was brewing, one made of longing and discovery, of tentative dreams taking root. As the night deepened around them, they found comfort and wonder in each other's arms, the rest of the world momentarily forgotten. Morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having washed the air clean and left a dusting of early snow on the highest peaks. Gabriella awakened to find Brendan already up, stoking the fire and preparing coffee. "Good morning," she said softly, a blush warming her cheeks as memories of the night before flooded back. Brendan turned, a smile lighting his features as he saw her. "Morning," he replied, crossing to where she lay and pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in years," Gabriella admitted, sitting up and reaching for her shirt. They shared a simple breakfast of biscuits and dried fruit, stealing glances at each other like love-struck youngsters. Neither seemed quite ready to discuss what had transpired between them or what it might mean for their future. But there was an ease to their interactions now, a sense of understanding that hadn't been there before. As they prepared to continue their journey, Brendan checked the trail behind them through the spyglass. No sign of those riders, he reported. Storm probably forced them to seek shelter lower down. With luck, they'll assume we did the same and waste time searching the wrong areas. They set off, following a trail that wound through stands of aspen and pine before beginning the descent toward the eastern slopes of the Medicine Bow. By midday, they had left the highest peaks behind and were traveling through rolling foothills that would eventually give way to the high plains surrounding Cheyenne. As they stopped to rest the horses beside a small stream, Brendan pulled out the rough map they had been following. "We're making good time," he said, tracing their route with his finger. "Another day and a half should see us to Cheyenne." Gabriella nodded, watching as he carefully refolded the map and tucked it back into his saddlebag. There was a confidence in his movements, a surety that reassured her. Whatever lay ahead, she wasn't facing it alone. "What will you do?" she asked suddenly. "After Cheyenne, I mean, if everything goes as we hope and I get the ranch back." Brendan looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "That depends," he said carefully. "On what?" "On whether a certain stubborn rancher might be interested in a partner." His lips quirked in a half-smile. "I'm pretty good with horses, you know, and I've been told I'm handy in a tight spot." Joy bubbled up in Gabriella's chest, threatening to overflow. "I think that could be arranged," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Though I should warn you, I drive a hard bargain." Brendan stepped closer, his hands coming to rest lightly on her waist. "I'm willing to negotiate terms," he murmured, bending to brush his lips against hers. The kiss was brief but full of promise, interrupted by the distant sound of a gunshot echoing through the hills. They broke apart, instantly alert. Brendan's hand went to his holster as he scanned the surrounding terrain. "Could be a hunter?" Gabriella suggested, though she didn't believe it any more than Brendan appeared to. "Maybe," he said grimly, "but we can't take that chance. Come on." They mounted quickly and set off at a faster pace, keeping to the cover of trees when possible and crossing open ground at a gallop. The sound of the gunshot wasn't repeated, but Brendan remained tense, frequently glancing behind them as they rode. By late afternoon, they had reached a point where the foothills gave way to more open country. Ahead stretched the vast expanse of the high plains, with Cheyenne somewhere beyond the eastern horizon. But to reach it, they would have to cross several miles of exposed terrain with little cover. "We'll wait until dark," Brendan decided, guiding them to a sheltered spot where a cluster of boulders offered both protection and a vantage point from which to watch the trail behind them. "Crossing at night will be slower but safer." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, casting long shadows across the landscape, Brendan took turns with Gabriella, keeping watch while the other rested. It was during one of her watches, as the sky was turning to deep gold and crimson, that Gabriella spotted movement on the trail they had traveled. "Brendan," she called softly, pointing. He was at her side in an instant, the spyglass already in hand. "3 riders," he confirmed after a moment, his voice tight. "Same ones from yesterday, I'd wager." "How did they find us? Good tracking, bad luck, or both?" Brendan's expression was grim as he lowered the glass. "They're still a ways back, but they're moving fast. We need to go. Now." Abandoning their plan to wait for darkness, they mounted and set off across the open plain, pushing their horses as hard as they dared. The setting sun was at their backs, which meant they were riding directly into lengthening shadows. An advantage, Brendan explained, as it would make them harder to spot from behind. They rode hard for an hour, the horses lathered and breathing heavily by the time Brendan finally called a halt near a shallow ravine that offered some protection. The sky had deepened to indigo, with the first stars beginning to appear overhead. "Did we lose them?" Gabriella asked, her voice hushed in the gathering darkness. Brendan scanned the horizon behind them, where the last light of day still illuminated the distant foothills. "I think so," he said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "But they know we're heading for Cheyenne. They might try to get ahead of us, cut us off before we reach the governor." "What do we do?" "Change our route," Brendan decided. "Instead of heading straight east, we'll swing north for a while, then approach Cheyenne from the Lodgepole Creek Trail. It's longer, but less obvious." They rested the horses for only as long as absolutely necessary before continuing on, now riding by the light of a waxing moon that silvered the prairie grass and cast sharp-edged shadows. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant in the vast dome of the sky. Despite the tension of their situation, Gabriella found herself marveling at the beauty of it all, the immensity of the starlit plains, the distant silhouette of mountains behind them, the rhythmic sound of the horses' hooves against the earth. And riding beside her, a man who had come to mean more to her in a few short days than she would have thought possible. They made camp shortly after midnight in a small hollow beside a nearly dry creek, not risking a fire but sharing a cold meal and taking turns keeping watch while the others slept. Gabriella's watch came in the coldest hours before dawn, and she sat wrapped in her blanket, listening to the night sounds and watching Brendan's sleeping form. In repose, his face looked younger, the lines of vigilance and care smoothed away. She studied the curve of his cheek, the slight part of his lips, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, and felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly took her breath away. When had it happened? At what moment had this stranger become so essential to her? Was it when he rode between her and Voss's men on that first day? During their quiet conversations at Foster's cabin? Or perhaps in the trapper's cabin, when he had looked at her with such tenderness before kissing her? Gabriella couldn't pinpoint a single moment. It seemed more like a gradual awakening, a recognition of something that had been there from the start, a connection, a possibility, a future taking shape. Dawn found them already riding, the rising sun at their backs as they continued northeast. The day warmed quickly, and they made good time across the rolling plains, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat a hasty meal. By late afternoon, they had reached Lodgepole Creek, a modest stream lined with cottonwoods that would lead them east toward Cheyenne. The trees provided welcome shade and cover after the exposed plains, though the trail along the creek was more traveled, increasing the risk of encountering others. "We should reach Cheyenne by midday tomorrow," Brendan said as they watered the horses. "Once we're in the city, we'll head straight for the governor's office." Gabriella nodded, trying to quell the mixture of hope and anxiety that fluttered in her chest. They were so close to their goal, yet still vulnerable until they reached the safety of the territorial capital. "What if the governor won't see us?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been nagging at her. "He will," Brendan assured her. "I have a letter from Foster. Turns out they served together during the war. It might not get us an immediate audience, but it should at least get us past the door." As evening approached, they found a secluded spot to make camp among a dense stand of cottonwoods. For the first time in days, they risked a small fire, carefully built to produce minimal smoke. Sitting close together as they ate their supper, Gabriella leaned comfortably against Brendan's shoulder. His arm came around her, holding her close in the gathering twilight. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly, noticing her pensive expression. "About tomorrow," Gabriella admitted. "About what happens if we succeed. And," she hesitated, "what happens if we don't?" Brendan tightened his arm around her. "We will succeed," he said with quiet certainty. "But even if something goes wrong, we'll find another way. I promise you, Gabriella, one way or another, you'll get your home back." She turned to look at him, touched by the determination in his voice. "Our home," she corrected gently. "If you meant what you said yesterday." His eyes softened, the firelight reflecting in their blue depths. I meant it, he said. Every word. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering on her cheek. These past few days, they've changed everything for me. You've changed everything. Gabriella leaned into his touch. For me too, she whispered. His kiss was gentle at first, then deepening with a hunger that matched her own. In the secluded grove, with only the stars as witnesses, they surrendered again to the feelings that had been growing between them since that first fateful meeting on the prairie. Later, wrapped in blankets and each other's arms, they spoke in hushed voices of the future of rebuilding the ranch, of the life they might create together. Dreams that had seemed impossible just days ago now felt within reach. We should get some rest, Brendan said eventually, pressing a kiss to her temple. Big day tomorrow. Gabriella nodded, settling more comfortably against him. Brendan? She murmured, already half asleep. Thank you. For everything. He pulled her closer. No need for thanks, Gabriella. What's between us? It goes both ways. You've given me something I didn't even know I was looking for. She smiled, drifting off to sleep with his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek and his words warming her more effectively than any fire could have. Morning came with a thin mist rising from the creek, burning off quickly as the sun climbed above the horizon. They broke camp efficiently, both feeling the anticipation of the day ahead. The trail followed Lodgepole Creek for several miles before turning southeast toward Cheyenne. As they rode, the landscape gradually changed, with more signs of human habitation appearing: fenced pastures, the occasional distant farmhouse, well-traveled roads. By mid-morning, they could see Cheyenne in the distance, a sprawling collection of buildings nestled on the high plains with the imposing bulk of the territorial capital rising above the surrounding structures. Almost there, Brendan said, relief evident in his voice. They were crossing a stretch of open ground about 5 miles from the city when disaster struck. Gabriella's horse, stepping in a prairie dog hole, stumbled badly, nearly going down. Though the mare recovered her footing, it was immediately clear that she had injured her leg, a severe strain or possibly worse. She can't carry you the rest of the way, Brendan said grimly after examining the horse's foreleg. Not without doing permanent damage. What do we do? Gabriella asked, stroking the mare's neck soothingly. Brendan considered their options. You'll ride with me, he decided. It'll slow us down, but we should still reach Cheyenne by early afternoon. They transferred Gabriella's saddlebags to Brendan's horse and removed the mare's saddle, leaving it hidden in a patch of tall grass. With a final pat and murmured apology to the injured horse, they mounted Brendan's stallion, Gabriella in front, within the circle of Brendan's arms as he held the reins. They had gone perhaps 2 miles when Brendan suddenly tensed, his arms tightening around Gabriella. Riders, he said tersely, coming fast from the west. Twisting in the saddle, Gabriella saw the distant figures, at least 4 horsemen riding hard in their direction. Voss's men. Most likely. Brendan urged his horse to a faster pace. They must have figured out we were headed for Cheyenne and circled around to cut us off. The stallion, already carrying double, couldn't match the speed of their pursuers. The distance between them steadily decreased as they raced across the open plain toward Cheyenne. We're not going to outrun them, Brendan said, his voice tight with concentration. Not like this. What do we do? Gabriella's heart was pounding, her fingers clutching the pommel of the saddle. For a moment, Brendan was silent, clearly weighing their limited options. Then, with grim determination, when I tell you, you take the reins and ride for Cheyenne as hard as you can. Don't stop for anything. What? Gabriella twisted to look at him. No, I'm not leaving you behind. The papers are what matter, Brendan insisted. You need to get them to the governor. I'll hold them off, buy you time. Absolutely not, Gabriella said firmly. We do this together or not at all." Before Brendan could argue further, the decision was taken out of their hands. From ahead of them came the sound of more hoofbeats, a large group of riders appearing over a rise directly in their path. "We're trapped," Gabriella whispered, despair washing over her. But as the new riders drew closer, Brendan's tense posture suddenly relaxed. "No," he said, a note of disbelief in his voice. It's the cavalry." Sure enough, as the dust cleared, Gabriella could make out the distinctive uniforms of U.S. cavalry soldiers, a patrol of at least a dozen men led by an officer on a bay horse. The effect on their pursuers was immediate. The 4 men reined in hard, hesitating only briefly before wheeling their mounts and galloping away in the direction they had come. Brendan urged their horse forward to meet the approaching soldiers. The officer, a young lieutenant with a neatly trimmed mustache, raised his hand in greeting. "Good day to you folks," he called as they drew near. "Lieutenant James Parker, 6th Cavalry. Is there a problem here?" "Those men were pursuing us," Brendan explained, indicating the now distant riders. "We're trying to reach the governor in Cheyenne with important evidence of corruption." The lieutenant's eyebrows rose. "Is that so? Well, you're in luck. We're headed back to Fort Russell just outside Cheyenne. You're welcome to ride with us." Relief flooded through Gabriella, so intense she felt light-headed. "Thank you, Lieutenant," she managed. "That would be most appreciated." As they fell in with the cavalry patrol, the lieutenant rode alongside them, curiosity evident in his expression. "If you don't mind my asking, what sort of evidence are you carrying that would cause men to chase you across the territory?" Briefly, Brendan explained their situation: Harlan Voss's attempt to steal Gabriella's ranch through a fraudulent debt, their journey to collect evidence, and their race to reach the governor before Voss could stop them. The lieutenant listened attentively, his expression growing more serious. "I've heard of Voss," he said when Brendan finished. "Man's got a reputation for getting what he wants, regardless of the means." He straightened in his saddle. "I'll personally escort you to the governor's office when we reach Cheyenne." True to his word, Lieutenant Parker and 4 of his men accompanied Brendan and Gabriella through the bustling streets of Cheyenne to the imposing territorial capitol building. Along the way, they attracted curious stares from townspeople unaccustomed to seeing cavalry soldiers escorting a dust-covered man and woman through the center of town. At the Capitol, the lieutenant's uniform and authoritative manner gained them immediate entry. Within the hour, they found themselves in the outer office of Governor John Campbell, waiting as an aide took Foster's letter and their names to the governor. "What if he's too busy to see us?" Gabriella whispered anxiously, smoothing her travel-stained clothes as best she could. "He'll see us," Brendan reassured her, though she could sense his own tension in the way he stood, alert and watchful even here. The aide returned promptly. "The governor will see you now," he announced, holding open the door to the inner office. Governor Campbell was a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, with shrewd eyes and a neatly trimmed beard streaked with gray. He rose from behind his desk as they entered, greeting Lieutenant Parker with a nod before turning his attention to Brendan and Gabriella. "Mr. Callahan, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of the East. "Benjamin Foster speaks highly of you in his letter. Please, sit down and tell me what brings you to Cheyenne with such urgency." For the next half-hour, they took turns explaining their situation, presenting the evidence they had gathered: Gabriella's father's journal, the ledger showing no record of any loan from Voss, and the deed to the ranch that Voss had been so desperate to obtain. The governor listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When they finished, he sat back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "This is not the first complaint I've received about Harlan Voss," he said finally. "But it is the first with such compelling evidence." He turned to Lieutenant Parker. "Lieutenant, Would you be willing to provide a written statement regarding the pursuit you witnessed today? Of course, sir, the lieutenant replied promptly. Governor Campbell nodded, apparently having reached a decision. Miss Hayes, I believe you have been grievously wronged. I will send a telegram to Judge Crawford in Timber Creek immediately, instructing him to dismiss any claim Voss has made against your property. He turned to his aide. Arrange for Deputy Marshal Wilson to accompany Miss Hayes back to her ranch as soon as possible. And prepare charges against Harlan Voss for fraud, intimidation, and attempted theft. Relief washed over Gabriella in a dizzying wave. Thank you, Governor, she managed, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you so much. The governor smiled kindly. No thanks necessary, my dear. The law exists to protect honest citizens like yourself. Now, you both look exhausted. I suggest you find lodgings and rest. My aide will arrange for the marshal to meet you tomorrow morning. Outside the Capitol building, standing in the late afternoon sunlight, Gabriella turned to Brendan, her eyes shining with unshed tears of relief and joy. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as the full impact of their success washed over them. We did it, she whispered against his chest. We actually did it. You did it, Brendan corrected, pulling back slightly to look into her eyes. Your courage, your determination. I just tagged along for the ride. Gabriella shook her head, smiling through her tears. We both know that's not true. I wouldn't be standing here if not for you. His expression softened as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. Well, then I guess we make a pretty good team. The best, she agreed, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his, heedless of the curious glances from passers-by. They found lodgings at a modest hotel near the Capitol, where the desk clerk raised his eyebrows at their dust-covered appearance but was quickly mollified by the sight of Gabriella's gold coins. After sending a telegram to Foster with news of their success, they finally allowed themselves to fully relax for the first time in days. The next morning, refreshed after a night in real beds and hearty breakfast, they met with Deputy Marshal Thomas Wilson, a no-nonsense lawman with 20 years' experience in the Wyoming Territory. The governor had briefed him thoroughly, and he was ready to escort them back to Willow Creek Ranch immediately. The journey back was uneventful, their party of 3 traveling without incident along the main roads. With an official of the law accompanying them, there was no need for the caution they had exercised on their journey to Cheyenne. It took 2 days to reach Timber Creek, the small town nearest to Gabriella's ranch. As they rode down the main street, heads turned and whispers followed them. The news of their confrontation with Voss had clearly spread. The town's sheriff, a portly man named Diggs who was known to be in Voss's pocket, emerged from his office as they passed, his face paling visibly at the sight of the deputy marshal. Sheriff, Marshal Wilson acknowledged coolly. I have official business regarding Harlan Voss and the Hayes property. I'll be speaking with you about it shortly. They continued on, leaving the flustered sheriff staring after them. At the general store, they paused long enough to buy supplies and learn that Voss had indeed posted men at Willow Creek Ranch, 2 of his regular enforcers who had been turning away anyone who approached the property. Not for much longer, Marshal Wilson said grimly as they rode out of town. It was late afternoon when they finally crested the ridge overlooking Willow Creek Valley. Gabriella reined in her borrowed horse, her heart swelling at the sight of her home nestled among the golden aspen trees, the creek sparkling in the sunlight as it wound through the pastures. It's beautiful, Brendan said quietly, pulling up beside her. Yes, Gabriella agreed, her eyes taking in every beloved detail. And it's ours. His eyes, when they met hers, were warm with understanding and shared purpose. Ours, he repeated, the word a promise. Marshal Wilson cleared his throat discreetly. Shall we proceed? I'd like to have this matter settled before nightfall. They rode down into the valley, approaching the ranch house directly. As expected, two men emerged from the barn as they neared, hands hovering near their holsters. "That's far enough," one of them called. "This property belongs to Mr. Voss now." Marshal Wilson rode forward, his badge clearly visible on his chest. "I'm Deputy Marshal Thomas Wilson," he announced in a voice that carried authority. "And you're mistaken. This ranch belongs to Miss Gabriella Hayes, by order of the territorial governor." The men exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not prepared for this development. "I suggest you mount up and ride out," the marshal continued, "unless you'd prefer to be arrested for trespassing, among other charges." After a moment's hesitation, the men decided discretion was the better part of valor. They retreated to the barn, emerging minutes later on horseback and departing without further argument, though not without dark glances at Brendan and Gabriella. As the sound of hoofbeats faded, Gabriella dismounted slowly, looking around at her home with a sense of wonder. After everything that had happened, it seemed almost surreal to be standing here again, to know that it was truly hers. "Welcome home, Miss Hayes," Marshal Wilson said with a rare smile. Gabriella turned to Brendan, who was watching her with an expression of quiet joy. She held out her hand to him. "Welcome home, Mr. Callahan," she echoed softly. He took her hand, his grip warm and sure. "Glad to be here, Miss Hayes," he replied, his eyes conveying far more than his simple words. Marshal Wilson stayed the night, occupying the small guest room while Gabriella returned to her own bedroom and Brendan took the bunk in the tack room, a temporary arrangement they had agreed upon for propriety's sake. The next morning, after a hearty breakfast cooked in Gabriella's kitchen, the marshal prepared to depart. "I'll be back in a few days with the official documents from the governor," he told them. "In the meantime, this property is legally yours, Miss Hayes. If Voss or any of his men show up, you send word to Sheriff Diggs immediately." "Will he help?" Gabriella asked skeptically, knowing the sheriff's allegiance to Voss. "He will if he wants to keep his job," the marshal replied grimly. "The governor's cleaning house and Diggs knows it. Besides, I'll be having a long talk with him before I leave town." After the marshal rode out, Gabriella and Brendan were left alone for the first time since leaving Cheyenne. Standing on the porch, watching as Marshal Wilson disappeared down the road, Gabriella felt a curious mixture of relief and uncertainty. "Well," she said, turning to Brendan, "where do we start?" He surveyed the ranch thoughtfully. "Fences need mending," he observed, "and that barn roof could use some work before winter sets in. But first," he stepped closer, taking both her hands in his. "First, I think we have some unfinished business." Gabriella looked up at him questioningly. "What business is that?" In answer, Brendan dropped to one knee, still holding her hands in his. "Gabriella Hayes," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I know we haven't known each other long in the usual way of things, but these past days, they've shown me more about you, and about myself, than years of ordinary acquaintance could have done." Gabriella's heart was racing, her breath catching in her throat as she realized what was happening. "I've been wandering for a long time," Brendan continued, "looking for something I couldn't name, and then I found you brave, stubborn, remarkable you, and suddenly everything made sense." He took a deep breath. "I'm asking if you'll marry me, if you'll let me share this life with you, this land, this home. If you'll let me love you for all the days I have left." Tears welled in Gabriella's eyes, spilling over as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, Brendan, I will marry you." He rose to his feet, gathering her into his arms and kissing her with a tenderness that spoke volumes. When they finally parted, both were smiling through tears. "I don't have a ring," Brendan admitted ruefully. Gabriella laughed. her heart lighter than it had been in years. "We'll worry about that later," she said, pulling him down for another kiss. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Timber Creek, with Benjamin Foster riding in from his ranch to stand as Brendan's best man and the widow Simmons, who had been a friend of Gabriella's mother, serving as her matron of honor. The news of Harlan Voss's arrest and the charges against him had spread throughout the territory, and many who had suffered under his corrupt practices came forward with their own stories. Judge Crawford, facing investigation himself, had resigned and left the territory rather than face potential charges. As for Brendan and Gabriella, they threw themselves into the work of restoring and improving Willow Creek Ranch. With the compensation the governor arranged for them from Voss's seized assets restitution for the harm he had caused, they were able to purchase new breeding stock and make much-needed repairs to the buildings. By the following spring, the ranch was thriving as it hadn't since before the devastating winter that had claimed so much of their herd. The pastures were dotted with new calves, and in the corral near the barn, Brendan worked daily with the wild horses he had captured and was gradually gentling. On a warm evening in May, as the setting sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Brendan and Gabriella sat on the porch of their home, watching as a family of deer grazed peacefully at the edge of the creek. "Happy?" Brendan asked, his arm around his wife's shoulders. Gabriella leaned against him, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child was growing. "Completely," she replied, tilting her face up for his kiss. As twilight deepened into night, they remained on the porch, talking quietly of their plans for the future, the addition to the house they would build for the baby, the new breeding program Brendan had designed, the possibility of purchasing the adjacent property that had recently come up for sale. Stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting on that fateful day when Brendan had ridden between Gabriella and danger, declaring with quiet authority, "Not one of you touches her." Neither could have imagined then where that moment would lead to love, to partnership, to a home and family built together. But sitting there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the land they both loved, they knew with absolute certainty that they had found what they had each been searching for all along. Not just a place to belong, but a person to belong with. And in the vastness of the Wyoming territory, where distances were measured in days' rides and people often went weeks without seeing another soul, that connection was the most precious thing of all, a love strong enough to stand against any threat, to weather any storm, to build a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. As Gabriella nestled closer in her husband's embrace, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, she knew that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together. And that made all the difference in the world.